I'm talking this morning to Todd C. Williams, who is an executive consultant with 3 decades of experience helping organizations to connect strategy with successful projects. He's worked on hundreds of companies ranging from startups and multi-billion-dollar corporations. Todd's the author of a couple of books, Filling Execution Gaps, How Executives and Project Managers Turn Corporate Strategy into Successful Projects, and Rescue the Problem Project. He's also a foster parent and is in the process of adopting 3 children. So Todd, let's start on the subject of executive sponsors. They now seem to be as influential in terms of projects as project managers. Do you get that sense too? And if so, why do you think that is?
I'm not sure it's changed. I think people are starting to finally see that there's an issue there. I think that the problems with executive sponsors have been around for a long time. And finally, there's some view of that. Even as I went through the interview process, doing the research, the surveys, et cetera, for the book, which actually started out as a white paper, but and evolved into the book, there were people who had no clue that there was a problem. There were other people who went, whoa, you are spot on. And I'm not talking about people just as project managers. I think project managers have known that executive sponsorship's been a problem for a long time. I just think at the executive ranks, it's finally starting to be seen as an issue, and they're starting to realize that I've met the enemy and it's me, and they need to start taking account of that. So you'll notice that in the book, whenever I actually talked to the executives, there were very few who acknowledged it as an issue, and that's changing. I've seen that changing over the last 3 years from whenever I actually did the interview on up till now. So when people have read the book or looked at the white papers or proofed some of it, because this has been heavily proofed by people out in industry, they've definitely come back and said, yes, this is an issue and we really have to solve it. So I think it was always there. I just think that the executives are just finally starting to realize that there's a problem.
Given the importance of the role, why do you think it's taken them so long, and why do they struggle so much with it?
I think there's this issue that if we have process is going to solve everything. And so executive sponsors felt that, okay, if we get people into Prince2, into PMBOK, into all these different methodologies, then it'll run itself and I don't have to pay attention to it. And they're finding out that that's essential, but that's not the answer. They need to be involved. So one of the things that I really feel that you need to have is someone who's totally accountable for that project's success. And to me, that's the accountable executive, which I'd love to change the name of executive sponsor to be accountable executive, because it actually tells people what they're supposed to do. And they have 3 basic things that they're accountable for. They are accountable for the business value of the project. Now, that doesn't mean scope, schedule, budget. That means what the value is, right? That could be very intangible. It could be very tangible. It could be anywhere in between. They have to be the fiduciary. Now, that doesn't mean that they're the person supplying the funds. It means there's the person responsible for the funds. They're making sure that the money's being spent correctly and that the people are getting out of it what they need to get. And then the other is they have to actually make sure that the project stays aligned with the business value or the business goals. So as we move a project and start going down the line, it tends to wander some, right? It may go a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. Unfortunately, the business is also wandering. If they wander the same direction, then they stay aligned. The odds of that are really low. So they have to make sure that these 2 things that are moving and dynamic, these 2 systems that are moving and dynamic, that they stay in one piece. And that's what the sponsor needs to do. I've had dozens of people, dozens of comments I could relay to you. One executive sponsor from a very large healthcare organization here in the United States, and she said, people come into me and I'm the sponsor and they spend 10 minutes telling me what's going on with the project and they expect me to make a decision. I can't do it. They're talking project babble. And someone else who says, oh, well, you can't have an executive accountable for the project. Nobody that high in the organization could be accountable. These statements are just, they're like, wow, you don't get it. Because if you're spending 10 minutes every month on a project, you're not the sponsor. If you say that executives can't be accountable, then who is? Right? So, there's this huge challenge out there for people.
You've given us a very clear description of the role of the sponsor. What do you feel are the key elements and the capabilities of a successful sponsor?
Leadership is number one. If you're not a good leader, if you're not signed up for it, a lot of companies, they really need a sponsor who's going to volunteer, who says, yes, I want to take this on. And if they don't have that internal desire to see the project go and move forward, then they're probably not a good sponsor. So leadership, desire, those are probably the two biggest attributes. And let me be careful here. When I say desire, I don't want someone who is going to be for the project 100% of the time. These people have to make extremely critical decisions. So they have to do what's right for the project and right for the company. That may mean that they have to kill the project. And even with all the desire, they have to be objective on how they're going to actually work and run the project and guide it through its paces.
Given that, are there some people or industries that make for particularly good sponsors or indeed bad sponsors? If so, why do you think that is?
So bad sponsors is easy. I don't think there's any industry that's worse than another, any domain that's worse than another. I mean, there's people who pick on IT, but boy, I sure didn't see that in my interviews. Maybe there's some other factor that makes it that way. But where I did see a very positive side of this is in the manufacturing world. And in the manufacturing world, especially new product development, their project sponsors, which are also known as product managers, okay, the same role, the same thing. They take the product from cradle to grave, and they're responsible, they're accountable for the success of that actual product. Well, that new product development, that whole thing is a cycle. It is a project. And they have been able to do a wonderful job at getting those product managers to be complete project sponsors. Now, what was interesting in some of those companies, I found that some of them actually used that same methodology in working on internal projects, and some of them didn't, okay? The ones who didn't use that same methodology had very poor success rates. The ones that did had really, really good success rates. So there's a company, I don't think can really say their name, large company, clothier company. I'm sure that you have some of their clothes in your closet, okay? They use the same methodology for their product managers as they do their project sponsors, and they ended up with beautiful success rates. They knew when to cut a project. They used that exact same methodology, that exact same mentality. And people can say, well, geez, you started 50 projects at the beginning of the year, you only finished 30, but the 20 they killed really early at a very, very low cost. So the return for their value, their money, was huge, and they did it all right. So it's not that a given industry is bad, but I think there is a lesson to be learned in the product manager role and how they actually do product management, and bring that into the project sponsorship role.
Now let's just imagine for a moment that I'm a project manager and I'm struggling with my sponsor. What do you think are the most likely areas where I'm going to have problems, and what can I do about it?
The line I hear from dozens and dozens of project managers is, my sponsor has disappeared. They're gone. They're disengaged. I do a skit type thing where I get people up and we model a project. And inevitably when I get to the project sponsor, I say, so where in the room should we put them? And they say, well, out to lunch or maybe golfing, right? They just don't see their engagement. So that's the biggest thing, is how do you get a project sponsor engaged? Well, part of it is back to that definition of what a sponsor is and who's eligible for the sponsorship. If they are into the project, they understand it, if they're behind it, they'll be engaged in it. So that's the biggest problem that we see, is they just don't have that engagement. That engagement is probably, and I think probably in most cases, it's probably well over 50%, is that the sponsor has something else that's more important than that project. Okay, so they have maybe something, report or something that's actually affecting what we call here in the States, the street, right? They have something that affects their quarterly earnings or whatever, and they have to go work on that. So they start forgetting about the project itself. The project's not on their bonus structure. So the project succeeds or fails, it doesn't affect their bonus. Why do they care? They're off working on their bonus. So by taking that project and just throwing it at somebody and saying, hey, this is also on your plate with everything else, there's an issue. So now it gets down to, what do I as a project manager, what say do I have over that? How can I affect that? I think one of the biggest things you can do is be clear with your sponsor on what you expect of them. In the book, I actually say, put together a job description of what you see as a project sponsor's job description and sit down and talk that over with your project sponsor. This is what I expect of you. You may get it heavily redlined. They may, say, forget it, I can't do that. You need to raise that to the appropriate people, saying, okay, if I don't have the sponsorship, if I don't have somebody in here that's my accountable executive, then we've got a problem. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to get this done. You can mold that. I've actually changed sponsors on projects and lobbied for that change to get a different sponsor. I've done that through direct routes, and I've done that through slightly nefarious routes, where I've told one sponsor that the project's going to be a disaster and it's going to look bad on his resume. I tell somebody else I want to be the sponsor that, hey, this will look great on your resume because we can pull it out as a team. I'm not lying because I do actually believe that. and all of a sudden I find that I've got a new sponsor because somebody volunteers to do it, and we're successful. So, it's influence. It's trying to get out there and make your allies. As project managers, we spend, I know this sounds so weird, we spend so much time focused on the project team that we forget that there's a world. We're inside a system, a large system, and we need to work that entire system. It's a very difficult job. We have to be leaders with no authority, and that's tough. And leading up is a huge portion of that. Very, very big.
If I change role now and I become the project sponsor, somebody who's looking to develop myself in that role or maybe move into that role, then what are the kind of things that I can do, and what are the kind of skills and experience that I should look to acquire?
Yeah, I don't know how things work over in Europe. Here, I don't think anybody would sign up for a project sponsorship role. I think that would be like, oh, wow, why would I ever do that? Back to the fact it's not on my bonus structure, right? It's just one more thing that gets added to my plate. So I think that if I was looking inside a company to say, hey, how do I improve that sponsorship role? Then I would be looking at changing the infrastructure on how it actually looks at that role. So starting at the top and saying, okay, we have a role here that's ill-defined. No two people know what it means to be a project sponsor. We don't have a way of selecting those people. So if I was going to go and try to get into that role, the very first thing I would do is to build the role and make it look right. That was one of the assignments that actually started this research on executive sponsor, is an extremely large medical organization here in the U.S. that asked not to be named, but everybody would know the name if I said it, came and said, how do we train our executive sponsors? How do we make that happen? And it was somewhat of a daunting task to understand what they were really trying to achieve and how do you do that. Well, you can't really train the executive sponsor if the people above them that are driving and picking those people don't have that infrastructure. So we started first with that infrastructure and trying to say, what is the role and what are the expectations of the organization, period. Then once we establish that, now we can get into picking the executive sponsors and setting up that role. That was a very, very different task than they were expecting. And so it was different, but it worked.
Todd, you highlighted project sponsorship in your book as one of the 6 areas where organizations have a gap between strategy and execution. If you look ahead to the future, how do you see the future for the role? And if you have a manifesto for organizations, what would it be for improving the role of the executive sponsor?
So let's look at all 6 gaps, because I think that all 6 gaps really fit into this whole thing. So the first gap, we struggled with a name for it. We call it common understanding. And that's the fact that executives speak one language and project managers speak another, that we speak scope, schedule, budget, executives speak value, right? So if we're looking at it from that standpoint, we have just this huge lack of communication between the two groups of people. So common understanding is an issue. Alignment is an issue. That is something I think squarely fits in the executive sponsor's role, is to maintain that alignment. But there's something inside the organization that needs to change for the executive sponsor to even be doing that. The third gap that I have in the book is the executive sponsor role. The fourth gap is adoption, organizational change management. Is this thing that I'm building actually going to be used and be able to be of value to the organization? It's probably the largest component of value. There's governance. Okay, now quite often the executive sponsor can be the entire governance organization for a project. Other times we use things like PMOs. Sometimes I think that moving over to that PMO organization to do governance actually takes that role away from the executive sponsor in a negative fashion. So they don't feel as if they have that responsibility anymore. So they kind of let up on that, which isn't very good. And then the sixth gap is leadership and being very strong leaders. So it really is that combination. If you notice, it kind of all that pivots around the executive sponsor themselves, right? So when I look at the future, I look for an executive sponsor who, first and foremost, as I said earlier, is a very strong leader, really understands how to make things happen, knows how to motivate people, create a vision, move forward. They're just the ultimate leader. They're accountable for certain things like the alignment and the adoption of that project, okay, or group of projects. They see everything that's going on. That they may have a huge governance piece in there saying, hey, this is how we're going to work it, and work with the project manager side by side to try to make things work. And that starts to break down that common understanding, that whole, what are we really trying to do and what are we really saying? So I see the executive sponsor as being somebody who's kind of outlined in the book here, okay? That said, you can't have just an island of an executive sponsor solving the problems. It has to be the bigger system that's in there to solve the problems.